welcome everyone to the third event of our Media Care Talk series. Good afternoon, people on the West Coast, and good evening for folks on the East Coast, and good morning for folks in other parts of the world. Welcome to the third event, and my name is Wentao Ma, a third-year PhD student in literature and the co-organizer of this talk series. To kick off our event today, I would like to acknowledge that UCSD is built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. Before we introduce our distinguished speaker today, I would like to announce our next event. On Tuesday, March the 14th, Professor Juno Salazar Pereñas from Cornell University will talk about her research on the relation between care and cruelty through the example of semi-wild orangutans and ex-circus lions under the title, When Does Care Become Cruel? Rethinking Care with Animals in 3 Scenes. This talk will be held in person at room 721 in the Public Engagement Building, UCSD, at 5 p.m. Tuesday, March the 14th. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Film Studies Program, Department of Communication, Department of Visual Arts, 21st Century China Center, Institute of Arts and Humanities Program for the Study of Religion, and Department of Literature, as well as Taranato, Rihanna Swace, Anthony King, and Michael Trujillo for their tremendous help. And now, it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Hannah Zeavin. Hannah Zeavin is a scholar, writer, and editor, and works as an assistant professor at Indiana University and a visiting fellow at the Columbia University Center for the Study of Social Difference. Zeavin is the author of The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, published by MIT Press in 2021. In the same year, Zeavin co-founded the Psychosocial Foundation and is the founding editor of Parapraxis, a new popular magazine for psychoanalysis on the left, which successfully released its first issue in fall 2022. She also serves as an associate editor for psychoanalysis and history and an editorial associate for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. So, welcome, Hannah, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much for everything, for the invitation, by which I'm so honored, and for that introduction. And it's so good to be with all of you. Thank you, and for all your sponsor. This event series is incredible. I'm really honored to be part of it. So I'm going to actually, the introduction makes me sound like very psychoanalytically oriented, and I am, but my work has a kind of strange relationship to psychoanalysis, in which psychoanalysis is often the object of my work. I work as a historian of it and technology and media, and today's talk is somewhat less psychoanalytically oriented than those sort of introductory sort of phrasings would make it seem. But I'm going to be speaking from my first book, the book that you just referenced, The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, which came out, as you mentioned, in 2021 from MIT Press, which has much to do with the history of psychoanalysis and our present. In the book, the relationship that's under consideration for the entire duration of the book is between therapists, broadly defined, and patients. The Distance Cure makes a few interventions via examining the therapist and their patient working at distance from one another. So it is a history of mediated care. Globally, it retells the history of clinical psychology via its shadow form, teletherapy. And instead of this being a recent concern, teletherapy and I'll argue telemedicine have both been about to make their grand debut for 100 years or more. I argue throughout the book that teletherapy is at least as old as therapy itself, if it doesn't actually predate the in-room scenario. Then the book first takes this extraordinary and vulnerable and intimate relationship between therapist and patient, and it recasts that relationship, not as a dyad between two people, but as a triad always already mediated and therefore extremely friendly to the introduction of new media and new technological regimes. At its core, the book argues that ever since Freud stopped laying hands on his patients as part of hypnosis, which was probably a very good idea, some intervening distance has always been present between patient and therapist. Then I proceed to look at how patients and therapists have bridged that distance in order for communication to happen. Mediated, networked, and teletherapeutic relationships physically literalize this separation, even as they work to diminish it. And as I conducted my research in order to make this critical history of a technique of teletherapy across the 20th and 21st centuries, I located that teletherapy always attends crisis, whether that's the war for liberation in Algeria, the Blitz over London, our current pandemic unfolding right now, or a suicide epidemic in San Francisco, which I'm going to be speaking about today. So while these cases are each, I think, quite obviously different from one another in their socio-political histories, in their histories of technology, and so on, I unite them by making the claim that distance isn't the opposite of presence, absence is, and we fundamentally misunderstood at a kind of colloquial level the difference between distance and absence. So I ask, if tele isn't an absence, if we can reconceptualize it, what is it? The book elaborates various forms of what I call distanced intimacy, one of which I'll be speaking about today on the telephone. So this book not only seeks to illuminate the ways in which therapeutic technologies come into being, but how they're adopted, exploited, and made part of everyday life. The Distance Cure investigates therapeutic work and what I call distanced intimacy carried out under the auspices of religious organizations, individual psychoanalysts, clinics, social services, and artificial intelligence labs, moving from the late 19th century across the 20th century, and yes, ending in our present. So the book is also transnational, as is the reach of therapeutic media considered in it. Each of my case studies required slight shifts in a set of approaches for collecting and analyzing data. And while the book's narrative is by its nature focused somewhat on the actors who might belong to the category of inventor or theorist or clinician, the history is also sensitive to the quieter stories of those who fall on the other side of treatment, the adopter, the user, the volunteer, or most classically, what we would call a patient. And it's in this latter group of actors that I'm going to try and show some of the problems of the method today in trying to see how they would have experienced these suicide calls I'll be talking about, as well as looking at the kind of top-down reorganization of care that's happening in our moment. So we'll see some documents like these that come from suicide hotlines in a minute. So just to say, there are very few documents that exist to support the archival material of this book that are sort of traditional archives. On the other hand, there was a plethora of the primary documents of treatment by distance in less well-processed archives. And we'll see some of that on the screen as well. And I'll try and describe them as we go. So currently on the screen is a pair of sort of check boxes and call sheets from a suicide hotline that I'll reference briefly, where volunteers could make notes on what was happening in the call, which then serves as a record for their very few direct recordings of mental health patient histories as produced on either side, especially as relates to the ad hoc suicide hotline. Okay, so to begin more formally in this talk, I'm going to be speaking about a bridge between my first book and some cases that have come out afterwards. This is very archivally driven work, and I'll look at its afterlives in new media and where much of my thinking actually in my second book comes from, although that wouldn't be clear at first blush. I'm going to be talking about the most ubiquitous form of teletherapy, which is the crisis hotline. Therefore, the talk deals with suicidality, but also police violence and psychiatric abuse. And so I totally more than understand if that's not what you wish to engage with in your morning, evening, or night. Okay. So across the 20th century and into our present, new modes of relating at distance have given individuals in crisis an ever-expanding set of tools for accessing mental health care. From World War II psychotherapeutic broadcasts to instant relay chats in the 1990s, letter writing to e-therapy, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and peer activists, who are the subject of this talk today, have attempted to send therapeutic care beyond the consulting room by harnessing quotidian, habitual media to connect would-be patients to the help that they need wherever they need it. The suicide hotline is just one such form of teletherapy, and it's premised on reaching users who otherwise couldn't access traditional therapy, as well as those in extremis. It's nearly ubiquitously available, it's free, it's feeless, and comes in over historically a household utility, or now the smartphone. And although the hotline has been relegated as a minor form of care and largely ignored by scholars, people still routinely turn to it. In the 24-hour period after Donald Trump was elected to the presidency in 2016, the San Francisco-based hotline TransLife reported that it received its most calls ever it had in a day. The National Suicide Prevention Line received more than double the calls it normally does in the hours after the election results were announced. After Hurricane Maria, calls spiked to Puerto Rico's sole hotline, and the service remained in high demand long after. And in the wake of COVID-19, new hotline services debuted with astounding speed to provide mental health care to nurses and then other emergency and essential workers. In a moment of personal and national crisis, people seeking help still turn to a form of teletherapy that was pioneered in the 1950s, the suicide hotline. Our question today is, how has picking up the phone and speaking or typing to a trained non-professional stranger come to seem like a favorable way to seek help and a crucial service to offer? In order to answer that question, I'm going to trace how we got from an ad hoc experimental phone service in the 1950s as therapy to the most sophisticated attempts at scripting, predicting, and even profiting off of crisis care. I will take us through the history and culture of crisis lines in the 50s and 60s, and then move directly to looking at the phenomenon of algorithmic crisis care in our present. So despite the fact that the United States only offered its first nationally funded suicide hotline in the year 2000, and earlier this year, last year, 2022, the FCC debuted a unified national number for suicide hotlines for the first time. That's number 988. The hotline modality is actually 70 years old or more, and it has an unexpected history. The first known suicide hotline was founded in London in 1953 by Chad Vera, a Protestant clergyman, and Vivian Prosser, who was employed by Vera's secretary, and sadly, I don't have a photo of her. Vera saw suicide and suicidality as a particular problem in his pastoral counseling sessions with parishioners. Firstly, the underlying mental states and sometimes concrete reasons that drove his parishioners to commit suicide were unspeakable, frequently related not just to Christian understandings of despair in the church, or even mid-century notions of loneliness and isolation during the economic miracle, but to concerns regarding both heteronormative and non-heteronormative sexualities. Secondly, Vera estimated that while many of his parishioners sought out his care specifically for their suicidal ideation, his stock piece of advice, consult a psychiatrist, was never followed. So Vera had been preoccupied by how to prevent suicide since the 1930s, when he first joined the Church of England. But it was in the 1950s, in 1953 specifically, that he decided to do something about it after reading a newspaper article in which it said, quote, "There were 3 suicides a day in Greater London." Vera wondered, how would they get in touch at the moment of crisis? In an emergency, the citizen turns to the telephone and dials 999. I looked at mine, fire, it said. But if you were on a ledge about to jump and needed a ladder, there'd be very few phones on the ledge with you. Police, it said. But at the time, suicide was a felony, end quote. So within and beyond Vera's church, where suicide rates were increasing, Suicide was figured as both a moral crime and a legal one. Suicide or the attempt of suicide both carried penalties in this twisted logic by which one could have committed a crime in and after death. But Vera wondered still, what if you could use the phone to call for help? What if there was a third choice, a non-state option? And this is what Vera and Prosser built. Vera accepted an invitation to occupy the rectory of St. Stephen's Walbrook, which was a church that had been bombed out during the Blitz and demolished during World War II, that had recently been rebuilt but had no congregation. Vera moved his practice there precisely because it was a rectory that lacked this congregation at all. Vera had established instead a telephonic church to serve an ever-shifting and scattered congregation, one that could invite new participants who would also be its patients. St. Stephen's didn't add, as many other churches in this moment did, a media wing or add on pastoral counseling. Instead, it was the medium of the phone that comprised the entirety of the church, its communities, its activities, and its infrastructures. The service was immediately popular, and it was well staffed due to its immense publicity in the public press and on the radio as a human interest story. So by 10 years in, 12 press clippings a day featuring the hotline were pouring into headquarters. Vera had realized that even with Prosser triaging a kind of proto-algorithm like script, the importance and urgency of calls, he alone could not serve as the hotline's only qualified counselor. And so he had initially began to meet that demand by training 50 volunteers interested in mental welfare who joined the staff. They performed, under Vera's training, befriendings, which is an ancient Christian name for a new person-to-person mediated relationship, in order to provide just a simple, consoling interaction over the phone, non-judgmental. Vera's ever-expanding group would eventually become known as the Samaritans, who still run the world's most used suicide hotline, which is still active to date. So this service and its use of peer-to-peer modality upsets the regimes of pastoral counseling and care, as well as psychodynamic therapies, each of which are its direct antecedents. This sin that can't be pardoned by a priest, suicide, breaches the church hierarchy and allows peers to step in and counsel each other directly. The new treatment modality circumvents both the need for expertise and the fee associated with it. It challenges every clinical concept associated with what psychoanalysts call the frame or structure and the dynamics of therapeutic encounters. It's contingent, it's not in person, and requires elaborating an intimacy with an unknown voice and ears with no guarantee of repeating the connection. And it makes use of the phone, an appliance paradoxically thought of as capable of bringing people together and as partially responsible for suburban alienation, the mixing of races associated with queerness and panics related to both racialization and queerness in this moment, as well as obscenity, as telephone historians John Brooks, Melissa Villa-Nichols, and Lana Rocco all show. And the appliance's deployment as a tool for therapy is rife with medium-specific contradictions, including a faith in that it's a private medium, when in fact, in this moment, phone lines were most frequently shared and shared infrastructurally, not just in a home, but across homes, i.e. the party line, and by family members inside a single home. So there's no privacy. And yet this therapeutic triad of phone, volunteer, and caller became not only thinkable, but widely adopted and used to help those in crisis. And it's important to note, therefore, that the hotline is not, as is generally held, secular in origin. And I'm going to talk about why this error persisted in histories of the telephone in a minute. But the hotline is Christian, and particularly it is Protestant. Its earliest forms began in the 1950s as services run by folks like Vera and Prosser, ministers, priests, and vicars, selectively adopted and started practicing psycho-religious pastoral counseling techniques pioneered in the 1930s and 40s by Freudian and pastoral partnerships, most famously and instructively like that between Dr. Smiley Blanton, who has one of the greatest names of all time, and the Freudian who is a Freudian psychoanalyst and a patient of Freud's, and Norman Vincent Peale of the Power of Positive Thinking fame, who had started the psycho-religious clinic of the Marble Collegiate Church in New York City in the decades prior. So much like the advent of AA and the growth of Christian self-help in the decades preceding World War II, this form of peer care was anonymous. And again, I'm just going to keep underscoring it, free. Each hotline had its own protocols, but it did not diverge from its anonymity and its freeness. These were essential to the form. By 1960, this form of pastoral care was widely spread. 140 ministers participated in pastoral counseling by phone, and 41 unique Christian telephone counseling services had been launched in 10 countries. The telephone counseling centers in New York were reporting 20,000 calls annually, Los Angeles 10,000 calls, and San Francisco 3,500 calls annually. This is both mediated therapy and a mediated congregation, in the words of Erica Robles Anderson. It's a second flock of believers reconfigured through a one-to-one individual relationship to the church, maintained by crisis intervention over the phone. But something happened when the hotline first appeared in the United States. In earnest, this was 1961, and it first appeared in San Francisco, which was the suicide capital of the United States at the time. And indeed, it had the second highest suicide rate in the entire world outside of West Berlin in the 1960s. And this hotline was helmed by Bernard Mays, a quote unquote closeted queer priest. This was his self-appellation. So when Mays moved to the Bay Area from the UK, he noticed two intersecting and interlinked groups of people in crisis on whom the city had turned its back almost with glee. An increasingly targeted queer community. This was the era of the Lavender Scare, and raids on queer spaces were commonplace, and those considering dying by suicide, sometimes by leaping from the notorious Golden Gate Bridge, which was part of San Francisco's own kind of self-image, or what we would now call branding. So Mays found, just as Vera and Prosser asserted in their work on the Samaritans, that a free, anonymous, peer-led help could allow callers to speak what was on their mind without fear of recrimination or carceral consequence. Now, this was crucial. Mays noted that his own community was especially vulnerable to suicide, given that they, quote, are unable to change their sexual orientation, condemned not to a week or a moment, but an entire lifetime of frustration by an ignorant and unsympathetic majority. They must suffer a situation neither medical opinion nor religious dogma are able to ameliorate, end quote. And this was urgent, right? 7 years prior, in 1952, the American Psychological Association had released the DSM-1, in which, quote unquote, homosexuality was listed not just as pathology, but as a psychopathic personality disorder, and it would remain so until 1974. In May's moment, psychiatric and psychological intervention saw queerness as something to cure, and it had the diagnostic criteria, but also the diagnostic power to carry out those quote unquote cures that ranged from electroshock therapy all the way up to lobotomy. So for May's callers looking to be helped with feelings of extreme depression and despair, psychiatry was therefore not a viable course of care, nor were adjacent state-based social services. And at mid-century, suicidology was now an emergent discipline, but it was housed within psychiatry. In the decade prior to Mays's hotline, new ways of understanding suicidality provided new diagnostic categories for ideation and for distinguishing dying by suicide from accidental death for the first time in the United States. So starting in the 1940s, a team of psychiatrists began to explore the roots of suicidal ideation, looking backwards to go forwards. They were Freudianly inflected this way. They collected genuine suicide notes from the coroner's office, first in Los Angeles, later from the Golden Gate Bridge, and then worked up empirical data supported by the new National Institute for Mental Health into a profile of the emotions of the suicidal at the time of death. They argued that these notes, which we can remark maybe are another distance communication of extremists, painted a clearer picture of suicide than psychologists had had access to in the consulting room previously. These asynchronous messages, often really banal and disturbing in their banality, were thought to contain evidence of ambivalence. And ambivalence was the sign for mainstream psychiatry that those who are trying to die by suicide indeed wanted to be saved. In 1958, this famous trio opened the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center to do just that, to get to saving. They took a multi-pronged approach, advancing suicidology research, locating those in extremis, experiencing what they called a prodromal symptomatology that led to suicide, and they deployed therapeutics, all in the name of preventing death. For May's part up the coast in the Bay Area, he only wanted to aid those who wanted to be helped. This was a crucial difference. He wasn't interested in suicide intervention as it was nascently being practiced. He wasn't interested in preventing suicide by any means necessary, including calling the police and helping to initiate hospitalization, which was the protocol down in Los Angeles. Instead, Mays wanted to provide a space in which callers could initiate their own care and set the terms of that care themselves. So to that end, Mays thought very carefully about how to bring this recent history of psycho-religious pastoral care, counseling, and other hotlines to bear on his service. He was deeply aware of Vera's Samaritans in London and thought very highly of it. He decided that he would not announce that he worked in any official capacity as a priest because he was worried that he would only receive calls from people in the church and that this would foreclose his ability to reach his own queer community. Mays wasn't yet out professionally, but he was in San Francisco. So the hotline needed to be separate from both the clergy and, as I think I've elaborated, from psychiatry, right? This was a matter of life and death. Mays therefore arranged for the entirety of his staff to be volunteers with no recompense for their time. They could never be accused of making money from suffering. But he also arranged for them to have no professional relationship to social work or the mind sciences. May's hotline is an example of a provider side extension and exploit within this barely codified psycho-religious framework. It's drawing on the therapeutic frame, and it was founded by a member of the of the church for explicitly psychotherapeutic purposes. But that relationship to the church was denied in order to reach its targeted populations, right, to actually help the queer community. And in addition, it also repressed much of what it was drawing on from Freudian psychoanalysis, which at this moment is nearly coincidental to the powers of psychiatry. What emerged then was a queer secular revision of a Protestant focus on the suicidal, a new iteration of this paraform. Like many other queer spaces of its moment, the hotline's physical offices were private and out of view, located in the basement of a hotel in the Tenderloin neighborhood, an area that was filled with many precarious groups of people, then as now, actually. So sex workers, the drug addicted, homeless people, the patrons of gay and lesbian bars, which were being raided, again, as I said, by police in the same year as the hotline began, and poor single men living in single room occupancy hotels. Outreach, first to prospective volunteers and then to clients, necessarily was handled differently than in earlier hotlines. Mays could not rely either on psychologists or church people to staff the center's telephone. He also couldn't rely on them to advertise it. Instead, he dropped matchbooks in bars like this one on the screen that populated the Tenderloin district, including recently reopened but previously raided queer spaces. All of those matchbooks contained a secret message on the inside flap. Thinking of ending it all? Call Bruce, PR1-0450, San Francisco Suicide Prevention. Bruce then had to wait for a call. Mays was Bruce. Mays was on shift that first night, and he was curled up on the couch like an analysand with a receiver next to his head, waiting. A call came in, and Mays paused. He took the time for exactly 2 rings to sound. This was as per his own extensive training manual. It allowed him and the caller each to take a breath before connecting. And then he picked up. Bruce and his assistants, who are here on your screen, Mays in front holding the red telephone, one of his assistants behind him actually holding Durkheim's Suicide, which was one of the influential texts on the hotline, then took an additional 30 calls in that first month. Mays adopted the inherent mobility and flexibility of Vera's telephonic church and built it at the intersection of the suicidal community and a gay population. And as the user type changed, so did the methods of outreach, volunteer selection and training, and phone decorum, extending a tailored social service to those unable publicly to name their despair. And callers began to use the service, and the suicide rate in San Francisco began to decline. And within just a few years, it was cut in half. So the first US suicide hotline posed itself, therefore, as an explicit alternative both to psychiatric care and to police involvement. Taken together, May's stance and practice constituted a revolution in US mental health care, and it drew substantial negative attention from experts in the field. So part of what was so radical about Vera Prosser and May's work was that it removed the stigma of seeking care by dislocating would-be patients from their helpers, adding a protective distance, making use of anonymity, and by shifting what help could look like. So those three psychiatrists down in LA became interested in empirical research on suicide. And as I said, they came up the coast to the Bay Area to look at the suicide notes of those who had died by leaping from the Golden Gate Bridge. It was likely during this work that one in particular, Zeavin, learned of May's suicide hotline and its radical use of peer care over the telephone. And although the Los Angeles Center had its own phone line staffed during business hours, Zeavin was incensed. He thought that by abandoning expertise and the fee, Mayes had made a category error, and that by using the phone as the total means of prevention rather than intervention, those with the power to intervene would be dislocated from the very people that Mayes was trying to save. Now, given the politics around prevention rather than intervention on Mayes' line, Zeavin's incredulity was misplaced. Dislocation as protection was exactly the point. Or put another way, the schism between suicide intervention and suicide prevention was displaced to his use of volunteers. So when Los Angeles failed to close May's hotline, they quickly adopted the protocol themselves, thus enshrining the common tool and technique for care across the next 60 years. Historians frequently misidentify the Los Angeles Suicide Center as the first suicide hotline in the United States, which is often why it's assumed to be psychiatric and secular, despite the fact that it was nearly responsible for the loss of this more radical technique. So the hotline thus shifts the power dynamic of the therapeutic encounter, and these affordances help set up the hotline as a popular alternative for marginalized and underserved communities, wary especially of psychiatric power and the police. And I want to add here that it was possible in this moment, and in fact, some hotlines did trace by hand the telephone wire to locate callers. The hotlines I've just referenced refused to do that, though it was possible. And I have an article coming out, I think later this year, about one hotline that in fact routinely used the telephone wire to find its callers, which then was depicted in a Hollywood film starring Sidney Poitier and Anne Bancroft called The Slender Thread that was released in 1965. And it was the first major motion picture depiction of a suicide hotline, and maybe still the most intense one to date. In that period across the 60s, as it's becoming ever more popular knowledge that this service exists, hotlines began to be made targeting specific services for all kinds of groups, for the elderly, for survivors of domestic and child abuse, lesbian and gay support lines, and drug addiction hotlines all debuted with astounding speed. And in conjunction, community activists set up referral services and warm lines for palliative care. Kate McKinney has a great chapter in Information Activism about one such line. And as just some examples of the many use of the phone line for extra psychiatric and extra carceral care provision, in 1971, Oleta Kirk-Abrams and Julia Schwertzinger founded the first rape crisis hotline, in part as a reaction to the hospital and police mishandling of Abrams' daughter's sexual assault. And Rafael Flores founded his own crisis support hotline same year in 1971, which he nicknamed La Familia, which was run out of the Washington houses in East Harlem and staffed by teen activists, the Young Lords. So the majority of these hotlines, including the largest and most successful networks, managed to operate just beyond the reach of psychiatric power and policing, providing an alternative, especially across the 1960s, to community mental health models that were being disseminated and the dangerous and punitive nature of diagnosis and carceral logics, which were applied to those in crisis. Which I want us to keep in mind as I talk about what's happening today along these same lines of intervention and prevention as we've moved to ubiquitous digital crisis services. So hotlines, as I said at the very beginning, now offer federalized care as opposed to the ad hoc services of the 1950s and 60s, although of course smaller NGO and activist hotlines are still thriving. In addition to traditional phone-based lines, new services that remediate the hotline into text and chat-based dialogues also abound, like Crisis Text Line, which is a nonprofit SMS-based suicide prevention program, which about a year ago was met with immediate outrage after its users found out it was profiting off of the data generated by those in crisis by selling that data to Loris AI, which uses the data to generate and train algorithms to provide customer service to Uber and Lyft. The FCC actually went so far as to demand the crisis text line cease that practice. These services also incorporate algorithmic triage and used gathered data as feedback and for research and for profit, but they aim to offer that same crisis care that countless users have turned to over the last 60 or so years. Anonymity, so central to the practices first championed by Vera, Prosser, and Mays, still feature heavily in the conventions of contemporary hotlines and chat lines, as does the practice of using volunteers, although now most frequently those volunteers often come with some kind of mental health background, and they hire clinicians as trainers and supervisors. So while hotlines still offer care under the sheltering sign of anonymity, that protection is now a fantasy rather than a truth. A volunteer may not know the name of their caller, but they may well know where they're located, down to the street address level. Many hotlines now listen like a state. Their calls carry with them a literal trace, geolocating their callers. So if a hotline traces their users either via IP address or on the landline, the practices vary. They may do so for a few intersecting reasons that are going to sound very reminiscent of the fight between Los Angeles and Mays in the early 1960s. The United States Federal Suicide Intervention Program hotline, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which was founded in 2005 and now runs 988, for instance, locates every single one of its users if they're given cause to for a dual purpose. First, because the federal line is, and this is a good reason, a coalition of over 170 local support centers. And so hotlines are redirecting callers from that central operating system to a local line so that callers can have up-to-date, precise local resources for things like food and shelter. But the second reason is that the federal lifeline practices suicide intervention rather than prevention, and is interested in stopping suicide by any means necessary. So part of what all suicide hotlines do is they evaluate their callers for risk of a suicide attempt. Again, these metrics have been shown to be extremely faulty. They rely on, almost 100 years of data, and they're shown to be increasingly faulty when AI is incorporated. There is extreme, extensive disagreement about whether or not hotlines should ever initiate what is euphemistically called active rescue in the first place. Hotlines that subscribe to non-consensual active rescue believe that calling a crisis line initiates an ethical demand to use every possible means to save that person. It is not at its base, and I'll just stress this, about liability, right? We can talk about that in the Q&A. There is no legal mandate to use this protocol. The National Lifeline reports that it uses active rescue in about 3% of its calls. Crisis Text Line maintains an active partnership with the NYPD, which they proudly display, it's no secret, and they initiate active rescue in about 1% of their calls, which is about 28 times a day on average, where 50% or more of their users are under 18. So for hotlines that are staunchly against intervention as a model, nearly all of the same arguments are going to apply in reverse, following Mays. In brief, these hotlines see their work as engaging with a caller, helping them via the tools and techniques of crisis prevention without ever threatening to take away the autonomy of their caller by jeopardizing their well-being further. The caller has chosen to call a hotline and not the police, and that choice is respected. The Samaritans, for almost their entire history, Trans Lifeline, whose logo is on the screen, do not practice non-consensual active rescue. No matter what, they refuse to involve emergency services and/or the police in crisis situations. These hotlines argue that calling the police and initiating involuntary psychiatric holds increases suicidality, period, for life, and studies back that up. But callers are also caught unaware when they call normative lines and the lines behind 988. Although they claim confidentiality, lines will break confidentiality for active rescue, and they tuck this into their terms of service, where questions of informed consent have been raised. Once underway, police involvement can jeopardize the safety of the caller and others nearby for a wide variety of reasons. Police training for crisis intervention is generally minimal, but it's always voluntary. And police violence is, as I hope we know, an uneven risk along lines of race and class and gender presentation and sexuality, but it is also an uneven risk along lines of neurotypicality. So in addition, callers that meet the criteria for active rescue are often armed with knives or guns, which taken together with this lack of preparation and racialized systemic violence can be deadly for the very person active rescue aims to save. So put bluntly and tragically, active rescues and so-called wellness checks performed by the police can and do end in police shootings and death, and they do so every single year. Given the racialization of criminality, threat to self can all too quickly be perceived to flip to life endangering the other, where here the other is the police. So this compounds the effects of a public health crisis and is in part due to the reconstitution of an older modality of communication in our datafied present. But also our understandings of suicidology have remained surprisingly consistent ever since the early 1940s. Suicide has been considered something that by and large affects white people, especially white men, who do account for about 70% of suicides in the United States per year. This is less and less the case, and this traditional understanding, as it rhymes with historical data, needs urgent reevaluation. Compounded by systemic racism and by the pandemic, suicide is now the second leading cause of death for Black children. And the suicide rate for Black children aged 10 to 19 is growing faster than for any other group in the United States. This pattern holds across children, regardless of race and gender, that suicides are rapidly climbing, most acutely with Black children. So as many scholars and activists and clinicians have attested since Malcolm X's autobiography in 1965, right through Liat Ben Moshe and Dorothy Roberts' latest books, psychiatry, community mental health care, and policing have long been part of the state apparatus. Here, as evidenced and represented by the American Psychological Association's call for renewed partnerships between psychologists and the police in the summer of 2020 as a response to the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. As Saidiya Hartman famously writes, if slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it's not because of an antiquarian obsession with the bygone days or burden of too long a memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that was entrenched centuries ago. So end quote. So the people who often might want to or need to turn to a free anonymous form of mental health care, including ones that actively court use by those under 18, are the same people most likely to be harmed by that very arithmetic Hartman invokes, the quantified surveillance and policing as extension of policy that can be associated with the hotline in our moment. Of policy, Fred Moten recently argued that in the wake of the uprising that began in 2020, that we can rethink policy as police and police as policy. This is ever more urgent. This past summer in 2022, all federally funded national suicide prevention lifelines and all of its 170 local affiliates are magnified this harm with the FCC 988 mandate, which began to route all calls to its new 3-digit number through its network, and their local affiliate mandates the use of geolocation surveillance and the sending of law enforcement and non-consensual active rescue using these faulty assessment rubrics whenever they point to quote unquote imminent risk. So the new rollout imperils the confidentiality that has long remained a bastion of care on the hotline while increasing surveillance on the most targeted of our community members. Hotlines were initially an experiment in what can happen when we don't call the police and instead perform mental health care in community by community without intervention. Contemporary digital mental health has increasingly smuggled back in exactly what Vera, Prosser, and Mays knew those in crisis needed to be able to avoid in order to receive care, interfacing with involuntary hospitalization and the carceral state, algorithms which are now used to triage crisis calls, and new platforms which remediate the hotline to make it more appealing to a broader user base, combined with digital efforts that bolster access to mental health and therefore open up a dragnet of surveillance. Digital mental health also turns care into a backdoor for state violence in a moment when so many are and have been vulnerable. Thank you so much for having me and for listening to me, and I very much look forward to speaking with you all in the Q&A and after Alain's response.
Thank you, Hannah, for this wonderful talk. It's time to introduce our respondent, Professor Alain J.J. Cohen. And in the meantime, to our audience, please submit your questions via Zoom. There's a Q&A button underneath the window of Zoom. The more questions, the better. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Alain J.J. Cohen. Alain J.J. Cohen is a professor of comparative literature and film studies at UC San Diego, as well as a practicing psychoanalyst and member of APSA, the American Association of Psychoanalysis. He has a pluridisciplinary and multinational formation in clinical and theoretical psychoanalysis, the history and analysis of cinema, aesthetics and philosophy, literary theory, semiotics, and art history. He has single-authored about 100-odd research articles in professional journals and scholarly volumes, and presented nearly 300 papers at invited lectures and conferences locally, nationally, and internationally. Through his teaching and research, Cohen has been dedicated to the dissemination of psychoanalysis, cinema studies, and semiotics. He contributed research articles about some of the major figures of French theory and has written extensively about the films of quite a number of auteur filmmakers such as Kubrick, Godard, etc. With regard to cinema and media, he likes to focus upon the interweave of punctual technique and its psychological motivation. Please welcome Alain, Professor Cohen.
Thank you, Wentao. Thank you so much for this introduction. And thank you, Hannah, for this illuminating talk. And I don't know if I'm going to be a good respondent, given the fact that the subject you have elected is perhaps slightly adjacent to what I'm doing and what you are doing as well. I like the way in which you describe the fact that the chip of psychoanalysis was sort of removed from your brain in order to work on this particular dimension, but I think it is not. I think it's very present. And I'm going to try to bridge gaps and show perhaps that it's not modular as much as flowing. And let's try something. And so I had the privilege of reading several chapters of your book on the distant cure, and therefore with this privilege I can perhaps focus on elements that I think are going to be elements of a Mobius between the crisis of in psychiatry and the crisis of suicidology and the crisis in psychoanalysis. How do I begin? I begin by quoting you on the question of distance being a pharmacon, being simultaneously a disease and a cure. And so we're really, in terms of distance, we're really talking about something which is very metaphoric and something which is also very literal. Metaphoric in a sense that if it is a disease and a cure, we are talking about crisis. And so the question of suicides elicits for us in crisis, krisein in Greek, the break, so to speak, the turning point as well. The question of crisis is perhaps illuminated by something which is extreme, something which is exponential, something which is how in pathology we redefine perhaps certain parts that are perhaps more everyday, more natural, more organic. And so by going to that extreme, we find the crisis in its zenith, in its apogee. And that's perhaps where we want to do something very specific here. You see, when we speak about psychoanalysis, we think about the so-called neutral observer, etc., and it has some echoes to the neutrality that you're thinking about. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Neutrality was well defined by, redefined really by Jones and others as being equidistant between a superego and the id, between the impulses that you would have in terms of the id and between the deliberations of conscience, so to speak. And so we have in the neutrality, in this equidistance, a certain level of non-judgmentality, which is very important for us, which is very important in terms of the people on the hotline as well. Non-judgmentality, I like very much the yo-yo that you have between, on the one hand, intervention and prevention. Okay, we have to deal with something which is both and neither nor, and at the same time, we are dealing with something very important in terms of timelessness of the unconscious. And so if we're in crisis, perhaps permanently, albeit unbeknownst to ourselves very often. So the unconscious is that which makes me travel in terms of distances, which makes me travel through all the time zones of my existence, and they're non-linear. In other words, I'm 5, I'm 40, I'm 25, and my shifting modes, and basically I'm trying through the trapeze of jumping from one time zone to another, I'm trying to find the affect which connects those different time zones and the affect which is missing from my consciousness and which is made to be conscious. And so at some level, and that's really what's so beautiful about it, that affect could be in crisis mode, in the suicide moment, in the suicidal ideation. In the suicidal ideation, in that crisis that I have in terms of no longer controlling the affect, I speak to whom? I speak to a telephone, I speak to a crisis. On the other hand, remember that the idea of psychoanalysis is to make yourself visible to somebody who is non-visible. In other words, it's gaining some sense in the way in which your mind works, having the luxury of finding how your mind works, but at the same time also finding the luxury of seeing how you can be totally magically thinking, dysregulated, demodulated, and as a result, something running out of control. And so it's that running out of control, which I'm trying to verbalize by having the secondary process, the symbolic order, the language, the culture, etc., try to map the primary order, the primary process, which itself is going to be far more the emotional and that which you try to articulate in language. And so basically what you have on the hotline is somebody trying desperately to make this articulable, verbalized. And in this verbalization, the only tool that we have at our disposal, because it's really the nonverbal needs some kind of articulation, the only tool we have at our disposal is really the articulation through verbalization, through the figuration, through the rhetoric, through the metaphors, through that which escapes me, something where I'm going to try to grasp the best level that I can find in intervening, or just perhaps, without being a good Samaritan necessarily, although I love what you did with a good Samaritan, which is biblically not so hot, but I like very much this good Samaritan in terms of I am going to perhaps have a chance, have a glimpse to, and what I find very, very hopeful in what you presented today is the idea that suicide abated 50% as a result of that. That's stunning. Something more, in terms of a dimension of the triad, as you have it in your book, between the dyad of the analyst and the analysand, and the triad literally of a setting. I would also refer to Ogden, a wonderful psychoanalyst in, I think he's in San Francisco, Ogden, who spoke about the psychoanalytic third. And the psychoanalytic third is very interesting and very, very close to some of the things that you described with the setting, the technology being the third, because this corresponds to the intersubjective creation between the patient and the analyst. And it is in this intersubjective simulacrum that you have a chance to go through the arc of a fusional ideal, a return to the womb, etc. At the same time, recreating the possibilities of distance between, but a healthy distance, the pharmacon of a good distance as opposed to the other distance. So I think that I would quote you as well on Melanie Klein, the greatest creator of psychoanalytic theory, and after Freud, perhaps. She is really speaking so well about the idea of projective identification, where you project something of yourself in the other, especially the bad part, of course, and introjection. And so, in a way, we're always dealing with the question of internal world and external reality. So it's always this move. And so no two cases are alike. You have an extraordinary crisis in terms of the war, in terms of a pandemic, etc. But no two people respond to it the same way. Everybody started speaking about the pandemic during the session, external world. At the same time, it's a way in which you internalize the reality of a pandemic, which is going to be so different, so nominalistic for every single person. War as well, two people from the same family, the same DNA, in the concentration camps. One of them is destroyed, practically the same milieu, the same age, etc. One of them is destroyed for the rest of his or her life. The other moves on without forgetting, but moves on. Okay. So this is really specific to the idea that you have this introjection projection, this projective identification, and this introjection, and at the same eternal balance and mobius between the external world and the internal reality. We want to get to the internal reality of each of our patients, for example, and in the hotline, what I find in the moment of crisis in suicidology, what I find so extraordinary is that you have very little time to address, literally, to get to the internal world of who is on the verge. So vast, so moving, but it exacerbates, it exponentializes. You're not doing instant therapy. You're doing something which is of a different nature and yet adjacent to that which we have a leisure to do with our neurotic patients, you and me, etc. We have a leisure to do over the years, and very slowly decanting and very slowly trying to unfold that which makes us miserable, that which makes us revel in our misery, in our anxiety, and be afraid literally of getting out of our cage. So in a crystallization that you have on a hotline, you are really representing all the experience that you have in the vast history of psychoanalysis, the 8 schools that we have present today in psychoanalysis, from Freud, the Neo-Freudian, Klein, the Neo-Kohart, Kernberg, etc. So you have all these different theories that are really after the same sort of nucleus, which I would represent as being the unknown in myself, the stranger within thee that I'm trying to. So the suicidal personality is really present in all of us. And it's simply a crisis that is going to trigger even more of that. The perverse personality is present in all of us. The psychotic is present in all of us, except that you have an arc. And so what's so wonderful about, from Durkheim to the present, what's so wonderful about thinking about it is this extraordinary moment of war, literally of the individual within herself, himself, this moment of war, this moment of conflict that needs instant resolution, as opposed to the leisure that you have when you say, in the timeless moment of a session, on a couch or otherwise, where you have that sense. You know, I did a podcast on contagion during the COVID, and in that podcast, precisely, I think that you have vis-a-vis the question of the pandemic, the relationship to the other, who is a relationship of desire, but a relationship of death. We were all wearing masks. Any stranger was a potential for death. And on the other hand, what you have in contagion, which is really wonderful, it's like Camus during the plague, for example, what you have is all the arc of possible reaction vis-a-vis the evil of a plague. In Camus, it was the brown shirts, it was obviously the Nazis. But what you have instead during the pandemic, during what we have incurred during the past 3 years, was the instant contradiction between desire and the other of death. And at some level, we are still there. The pandemic is, but, and I think it's very important, at some level, it led us to a dystopia, and that dystopia is not really eliminated because we are post-COVID, sort of, but it's still present in all of us. So we had the opportunity, as you said yourself in your wonderful book, the rupture lays bare the conditions we would not see otherwise. So basically the rupture that you have through the pandemic, the rupture that you have through the crisis of the suicidal personality, the rupture there lays bare precisely an extraordinary potential that we have the opportunity to focus upon, but albeit in an instant, and that instant crystallizes everything else. So what do you have in the patient-adolescent extraordinary relationship is that extraordinary transference for the power of the good, and at the same time, the counter-transference on the part of the analyst. And so in this dialectic of counter-transference, transference, the creation precisely of evidence, third, but the creation also through the technique, etc., of the non-neutrality whatsoever, because you know exactly what's on my walls, you know exactly, you hear my voice, you know my age, you see my personality, etc. So it's at the same time something that creates the conditions of possibility of saying, with this counter-transference and my reverie, with my mentalization, with my mentalization of the patient, putting myself in her shoes, and at the same time, the question of not only putting myself, but promoting much more insightfulness in the patient, you do have an extraordinary model, and the arc that goes from the extraordinary crisis that you described and the leisureliness with which we think we describe a very slow crisis in terms of being on a couch 4 times a week, having all the time in the world to explore. But all this time is compacted. Remember, the unconscious is timeless, in the same way as your crisis is timeless. At any rate, I've spoken too long, but I wanted to bridge as many gaps as I could in as short a time as I had. Thank you so much, Hannah, for your wonderful, wonderful engagement with the issues.
Thank you so much. It was so moving. Thank you. And yes, you brought so much else of the book and so much else beyond that into the room. Thank you.
Thank you.
So to the audience member, again, please feel free to ask questions, and to kick off that process, I have some questions for myself. Again, thank you for this wonderful talk. I want to ask questions regarding the telephone answerers. So the one who were the mediators, who picked up those phones. What was the training exactly that they went through? And also for therapists nowadays, they were trained to distinguish, like what is your emotion, what is that emotion sort of brought by the patient that you're seeing, and also Alain just mentioned transference, counter transference. So is that part of the training that they through? And do you have, or do you encounter any story within your archival research, like any story regarding transference, countertransference, the sort of memorable experience from those telephone answerers, regarding their experience? So that's the first question. Sorry, second question is about the secrecy and confidentiality of the record, because they pick up a phone, they note things down. What do they do with those? Did they do with those notes? Yeah, that was another question that I'm wondering. Like, and also, did they gossip about their patient, about their people they talked to, with their peers, with their families, with other people around them? Yes, two questions I want to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm also going to try and bring in some of Alan's amazing response. But so with the second question is easiest, right? Which is quite direct. You've asked a kind of methods question, like how do I know what I know and where was it? So yeah, these hotlines, as I said, none of them there was no federally funded hotline until very recently. So these are all ad hoc services, often activist, community-based, that sort of starts in the church, then sort of becomes secular, blends with psychiatry, blends with Freudian analysis as part of the kind of therapeutic society, if you will. That's pretty much the pattern across this time period until we start getting those very specific activist hotlines that are attached to other efforts to change mental health care in the United States. I mean, the Young Lords were actively invested in thinking about community mental health in their famous hospital takeover and so on in the Bronx. So what happens is that people have a lot of paperwork. And I think this is like the maybe unconscious nod at my dissertation advisor, who wrote this amazing book, The Demon of Writing, about the demon of paperwork in the French Revolution, Ben Kafka. It's a beautiful book, right? But there's tons and tons and tons of paperwork, but it's very low level. So the question is, what gets saved? I had up on the screen, I could reshare, but maybe it's too complicated, right? These endless documents that have these kinds of triaging that are much closer to what we see now with algorithmic, patient processing. Andrew Leah has a beautiful book coming out this year called Digitizing Diagnosis, much more on that side of things than on the transference, countertransference, client notes, patient notes side of things. But they did keep a great deal, some of these hotlines. And I write in the very introduction to my book, this is the third chapter, that I really don't believe that when people called these hotlines, these nascent form of care in the 60s in crisis, that they had a thought of a historian 60 years later seeing their intimate concerns. And yet I have. And so, with this work, another example comes from a child patient of Winnicott's, whose files I saw, which I wasn't supposed to. A lot of the great work of this book was learning and then unseeing the records and trying to keep and hold a kind of confidentiality that I was, like all, historians of psychiatry who are trying to do patient-centered work, breaching. And so I thought a lot about that, the ethics of the method and what was available greatly. I don't think they were gossiping, but who knows? I think people took it very seriously, that remit. I worked on a hotline for nearly a decade, the 1971 rape crisis hotline. I worked on it the entire time I lived in Northern California. still extant. No one was, going to talk gossipingly about a caller, but you do talk on hotlines. This gets to your question of transference. Here's the segue. You do talk about your callers by their initials or by characteristics of their voice, because you are, as a collective, serving individuals. So there is this group to individual treatment happening. And so there may not be, I love this so much, the luxury of finding out how the mind works. That's your line. There may not be this classic 4 or 5 times a week, although many patients 4 or 5 times a week, it's not enough. It doesn't feel enough luxury, right? It's like more, give me more. Klein would say, give me more breast, right? But for the suicide crisis hotline caller, or the rape crisis hotline caller, or the addiction hotline caller, the hotline being operative, there are all of these things that the caller can do to secure more than what the immediate frame wants to offer, which is to say, I like your voice and your personality. I will call you every Wednesday at 1 p.m. No doubt. And I will do it every single day, every week, for years, for free. And actually at that point, the person is not in apex crisis, right? Some of the childhood emerges, especially if traumatophilia occurred in childhood in a kind of direct way that relates to the remit of the hotline. Or they will hate your voice and your personality, and they will never call on Wednesday. Or they will call the maximum amount a hotline will allow. That's when you get listservs now in the 21st century. You would get notes left to other volunteers in the 1960s that say, this caller's already had her call. We have to serve more because there's one dedicated phone line, right? So now with these services that are kind of like mushroomed and networked, you don't tie up the line necessarily, although some you still do. It's still a 1-by-1. So this transference, it's not the kind of deep transference of the analytic scenario, but it's more like the transference of everyday life. And, the dealing with the pain of projective identification, I mean, it's horrible, right? It's something that people talk about, right? Why do I feel so hated? Why do I get off this call and I hate myself? Right. And there are all these different theories that across this period are going to try and think about that, including secondary trauma, including very much contemporary objects relation, like a whole range of what is happening to the volunteer. And some of those are much more analytically inflected, and some of them are not, right? They're sort of post-analytic trauma discourse. But all of it's at play in this wash of 20 years. It's a fascinating time that I really enjoyed is the wrong word, but felt captivated by thinking about the 1950s to 1970s, because it really is the sea change in US psychiatry from a largely Freudian model through the failed Community Health Act into the absolute dominance of cognitive behavioral therapy and psychopharmacological drugs on the other side. And it's in those 30 years that we see, and this is the last thing I'll say, all of this play with how much scarcity would be the opposite of luxury. How much scarcity can a patient tolerate and still have an effective cure? And that is the question, both in terms of rescinding the volunteer, rescinding the expertise radically, right? How short can you hold someone and have them feel better is the experiment of the hotline. And it's the experiment that continues with cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's the experiment that continues with very little oversight in the psychiatrist's office. I'll stop there. Thank you. It's a fantastic pair of questions.
Good. If I may.
Oh, sure, Alan. Sure.
If I may, just for the sake of intellectual pleasure, I think there's a kind of wonderful reverse analogy between the group therapy and the group of callers. So it's as if you have many callers ready to respond for a single patient, as opposed to group therapy, where you have a group and you have a single therapist in the middle. But I also wanted to ask you whether there was a conversion from the telephone hotline to what saved our civilization during COVID, basically the Zoom. So has it gone on Zoom now? is a hotline Zoom-esque, so to speak?
It's interesting. So a lot of what's adjacent to the hotline, so the hotline, right, is born mediated, right? So it just kept going. You know, it was still on the phone. The calls spiked everywhere again, or there are new services that are remediating. They're either text on the computer or text on the phone. But that had already happened pre-pandemic. What did happen was that group therapy moved online to Zoom. AA moved on to Zoom. And this is really interesting to me because all of the conventions of Zoom are professional, you know, and the way Zoom specifically as a platform enters the therapy enters the dynamic of something like AA, where you don't want your name on the screen.
Yes.
I mean, you can change your name, you can make it whatever, but that you are working all day long on your Zoom where you need both names, or right, and then you're flipping. And there's a very beautiful story I tell at the end of my book. It's not my story, so I can call it beautiful, from a beloved friend, Erlinsker, who's a clinician in New York, and they were very worried at the start of pandemic. They were kind of anti-tele. As many people were. And, you know, some people would call me. My book was done when the pandemic started. I should say that. I went back and added a coda with some very preliminary thoughts about the start of the pandemic and the uprisings of 2020. But Eric called me and said, I'm very nervous about this. Like, it's not the same thing. And I tried to say, it is not the same thing. That's not the point. You can't do the in-room. This is a thing that you can do, right? That's how we know they're not the same, these two modes of care. One brings out contagion. And Alain, I'm wondering if you know this paper by Giuseppe Citrevese, who wrote this beautiful paper on contagion and the pandemic.
I read it in your book.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's great. And Air tells the story, right, of a young autistic child who only was doing play therapy with Air, and that's because of age. And then they figured out you have the whiteboard, and you can use the whiteboard to sort of replace Winnicott's squiggle game, and how moving this was to them and then to me, like significantly the most moving, sane-making thing that I heard in the early pandemic. But even if we think about that, the whiteboard is there so that you can not just profess, but in business meetings. Mm-hmm. So there are all of these small things that I think are happening at the level of medium, but then I think it's also, you know, again, irrespective of how much luxury we have, I try and make the argument at the end of my book that what the mediated configuration of a therapy is going to rhyme with something internal. So that there is, and that's a very Kleinian hypothesis, that there is something inside that is going to rhyme with the thing outside, and the thing outside being the medium. And I try and make this gesture like around the question of glitching, or the question of, you know, how we tolerate when the call drops or not. You know, and some patients are fine, they just call back, and other patients are not so fine. And it's no judgment, right? It has to do with what's happened, you know, around being dropped, which is one of the major metaphors, is the opposite of holding, of psychoanalysis. So I think that there's all of these different layers, and on the hotline, that's something that you can see. You don't need 5 times a week. People have really different reactions to having the call drop. Yes. And now, just to bring it back to the talk, now one of the most disturbing things to me about the 988 rollout and geolocation is that imminent threat to self. One of the ways you qualify is if your call drops. So if the service cuts out, the police will be sent to your home.
Absolutely.
And we all know, I mean, so I think that, you know, Adam Phillips has this line that I really is the inspiration for the end of my talk, which is psychoanalysis is the experiment of what happens if we don't call the police and we do something else instead. And I think that's also part of it too. It's the luxury to not call the police. And that's a luxury that I militantly believe should be everyone's. Yes. Again, irrespective of access to the other entrappings of the fantastic analytic scenario, for which I am obviously a booster, right? It is bizarre to evangelize for it, and yet.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, in the training, you are told that you cannot do anything to prevent somebody who wants to commit suicide, but that you'll feel guilty the rest of your life, no matter what. And so I only had one patient who did, and I must tell you, to this day, it really kills me to think about it, and going into retroaction and hindsight, if only, when in fact it would not have worked. But at UCLA, at the NPI, for example, if a patient who is suicidal is left alone 5 minutes, he or she will find the opportunity to commit suicide. And so it's really the kind of the negative of the hotline, because when you have somebody on the hotline, you have the unconscious desire not to do what I want to do, as opposed to somebody who doesn't speak about it, and therefore waits for you to be out of a patient's room, and therefore hangs herself or himself or something like that. So it's really extraordinary. But so many thoughts. Maybe we'll talk some more about it. Let's get to the Q&A. so we'll do it later. Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually prefer that you do it right now because we are expecting more questions from our audience members. So please submit as many questions as you want, and there's no small or big questions. Everything is welcomed here. So thank you. So yeah, Alan, you have the luxury to ask one more question, just to further kick off this sort of Q&A process. Yeah.
Well, let me have the pleasure of continuing then. I think that the question precisely of the crisis, the question of and the crystallization that I'm keen on underscoring, the question of in a moment, the people who are perhaps not so well trained in terms of the history of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, counseling even, but who are perhaps indignant by the situation in which they find their would-be patients, so to speak. Those people perhaps could benefit from more training in the arc that goes from everyday garden variety neurosis to psychosis to perhaps even dementia at some level, because we are really dealing with something which is not so modular in itself. As I pointed out earlier, we all have in ourselves those elements of psychosis, of obsessionality, of hysteria, of perversions. We have all these which can be exacerbated. We have this potential madness in ourselves. Lacan is very good. You probably know the article on Sade and Kant. Kant with Sade.
I don't. I'll look it up.
It's magnificent because in exactly the same period, in the 1780s, you have the writings, the second critique of Kant on ethics, and the Marquis de Sade on the utmost of perversion, etc. So you have Kant as a super-egoic figure in the history of philosophy and ethics, and you have a Marquis de Sade who undermines everything, who wants to pervert the world, to debauch the world, etc. And so Lacan argues very well that it's not Kant or Sade, but Kant with Sade. In other words, Kant needs his Marquis de Sade in the same way as the Marquis de Sade needs his Kant in order to precisely work in tension and counter-tension. So again, with patients who are depressed, etc., the point is never to say, look at the silver lining, you have a great love around you, you have a great career. No, you bring them to the bottom, really to reach bottom, so that they emerge by themselves, instead of having this kind of this kind of language of support and counseling by saying, you're doing great, you could do great, life is really wonderful. No, you don't do that. You say, it's very depressive. Let's go into your depression instead of denying it. And I think that I heard only through a student of Garfinkel at UCLA in sociology, ethnomethodology, who was studying literally those tapes that you are mentioning regarding. So ethnomethodology is very close to semiotics, very close to psychoanalysis, basically, where you focus so much on how it is said, the intonations, the pragmatics of language, much more than the semantics itself. You listen to the music. And so it's very pertinent to go there and to be able to have all the training in the world, I would say. What is your take on this?
And I think just following off of what you're saying, you know, there recently it's been remarked, and I know we're about to run out of time, that, you know, psychoanalysis is back. And I think that when you're talking about that idea of like, no, you have this great love, that's in suicidology, that's called protective factors, right? You're supposed to tell people there's a reason to want to stay. But I think that, you know, depression, that great affect of late capital, right? That it's so important to people to hear it like it is, right? We have turned against what we now call toxic positivity. And I do think that psychoanalysis in all of its 8 schools, right? And I have very mixed feelings about various of them, but in all its 8 schools, basically, no one talks down to patients. That's not the problem. No one thinks it's simple. There is a theory as complex as a subjectivity and as complex as pain and the pain of being alive. There are certain schools that will also take up, and I think this is crucial, like the material of the world. And then I think you basically have it. But I think that that's this place where it wasn't just that the early hotline folks, for instance, knew that they could create something short term, but that would open onto despair, true despair, and that they would sit and they would hold it. But also that callers knew that they could call in and just have a place to name it. And that is the classic kind of analytic function, right? Again, is to name it. You know, it is about going after it and naming it and giving it a name and separating out what's been projected into one from oneself, but via language, right? And I think that that's, you know, I think these are these places where we can really see the successful care of the other. Like, yes, it's pure, it's in community by community. There's the absolute dismantling of any idea of neutrality, and I'm all for it. But I think it's also, it takes up that remit from the psychodynamic, which is what you say will be held rather than turned away from. And I think that it truly is, of all of the things we have on this earth, it's one of the most powerful things for care.
Absolutely. You know, a patient starts out a session by saying, I'm really annoyed. And so you work with annoyed. You can be very literal in your metaphoric apparatus, in your rhetorical apparatus, and so on. So you say annoyed, and then as the session progresses, you say, you seem to be more than annoyed, you seem to be upset. I don't know what, am I, is it resonating with you? Actually, yes, I'm upset. And at the end of the session, you seem to be in a state of rage, and you minimized it by saying, I'm starting today annoyed. I think you will go there through language. And again, that's when suddenly you have a coincidence between the primary process and the secondary process, where the symbolic order of language, culture, mythology, you name it, comes in to help and to say the articulation has hit. And I'm sure that on the hotline, there are moments when this occurs. Once again, the positive is that somebody is calling the hotline. And therefore, there's a kind of reversal of desire to turn around my suicidality into something else, I want to find in myself, through you as a self-object, I want to find in myself the power that I think I am lacking. And it's not that I'm refueling with you, but by this dynamic, I'm going to find I hate to overuse the term resilience after it's been so overused during COVID, but I'm going to find the resilience of jumping up again, perhaps. It's not that I won't be depressed anymore, but it's that I will have the tools to prophylaxize that depression. and to prophylaxize the dependency that I have on drugs, my anxiety, my neurosis, etc. I'm going to prophylaxize it. And thank you for helping me as my correspondent on the hotline. That's why I was asking you about Zoom and whether Zoom intervened a lot in the evolution of the hotline. You see. Anyways.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's what you've just done for me. So I'm so grateful, right? It's the perfect meta end. Thank you.
We'll continue.
So, sorry, I really want this wonderful conversation to proceed, but the time is up, and as any other person in this room, we enjoy this wonderful conversation and the talk and the response. And thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Alain, for your wonderful work. And to the rest of you, have a good night. And our next event will be in person at 5 p.m. At the room 721 in the social engagement building on UCSD campus. We'll see you there. Thank you so much.
Just 1 second, Hannah.
Yes.
Hannah, I'd love to discuss your book because I was really taken by it. So maybe we'll have a Zoom we didn't have in November. We'll have a Zoom. We'll make an appointment. I just wanted to say that. But thank you so much for the book and for your presentation today. And the pleasure of this dialogue is remarkable. And Wentao, you're sublime in having bridged up.
Well, you are sublime. It's my pleasure to host two of you and bring you two of you together. And I'm so happy and I'm so invested within the past an hour and a half. I haven't been this invested like intellectually for several days, I have to say. So it's also like a care for myself, a sort of care with distance for myself intellectually. Thank you so much. And also to all of you who are watching it, who are here, we hope this is also could be also a care or the beginning of a care to all of you. So thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.